What lifeguard got fired after saving everyone at the pool? The whistle blast cut through the afternoon heat 3 seconds before I saw the kid go under. Not flailing or screaming like they show in movies. Just there one moment and gone the next, disappearing beneath the surface near the deep-end drain. My body moved before my brain finished processing, launching off the stand and hitting the water in a flat racing dive that sent waves across the pool. 12 years of competitive swimming and 2 summers as a certified lifeguard compressed into pure muscle memory as I pulled the 7-year-old boy from the bottom. His lips were already blue when I got him to the edge, tiny body limp as I hoisted him onto the concrete. CPR started automatically, my hands finding the right position on his sternum while someone screamed for 911. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, watching his chest rise and fall with the air I forced into his lungs. The chlorine smell mixed with something sharper, metallic, like pennies in my mouth. His eyes snapped open on the 4th cycle, and he vomited pool water across my lap, coughing and crying and alive. The mother appeared from nowhere, dropping her phone and her iced coffee to scoop up her son while he sobbed into her shoulder. She was thanking me through tears when I noticed the other end of the pool, where 3 more kids floated face down in the shallow section. Time fractured into individual snapshots after that, each moment burning itself into my memory with perfect clarity. The second rescue was a girl maybe 5 years old, her pink swimsuit bright against the blue water as I yanked her up and passed her to a parent who'd followed me in. The 3rd and 4th were twins, both underwater in that horrible, peaceful way that drowning victims sink when they stop fighting. I got the first twin breathing on the deck while dragging the second onto the concrete with my other arm. My certification instructor's voice echoed in my head about triage and priorities, but there was no time for protocols or procedures. Just grab, pull, breathe, compress, repeat. The 4th kid started breathing on his own before I finished the second rescue breath, which meant I could focus on the twin who wasn't responding as quickly. Her chest barely moved under my palms during compressions, so small and fragile that I was terrified of breaking her ribs, even while knowing broken ribs were better than being dead. She coughed up water and started crying, and I moved to the next victim without waiting to see if she was really okay. Somewhere in the chaos, I registered that the pool had maybe 40 people in it when this started, and now bodies were just floating everywhere. The shallow end was the worst, because parents had left small children there thinking it was safe. But safe meant nothing when every single kid in the water was unconscious. A teenager floated near the steps, face down with his arms spread wide like he'd been trying to swim to the edge when whatever hit them took him under. I got to him 5th, rolling him over to find his eyes open and staring at nothing, pupils dilated huge and fixed. No pulse when I checked his neck. CPR started again, harder this time, because he was bigger and needed more force to move air through his lungs. 15 compressions in, he gasped and turned his head to vomit, and I was already moving to the next person before he finished throwing up. An elderly woman floated near the diving board, her gray hair spreading around her head like a halo. She'd been doing laps when I arrived for my shift. I remembered that. Steady, freestyle stroke, impressive for someone her age. Now she drifted motionless in the deep end. The dive to reach her took longer because I had to go down 12 feet, my ears popping from the pressure as I grabbed her arm and kicked toward the surface. She was heavier than the kids, dead weight that fought against my attempts to lift her onto the deck. Someone helped pull her up while I treaded water, my legs burning from the repeated dives and rescues. Her pulse was there but thready, her breathing shallow and irregular. I tilted her head back to clear her airway, and she inhaled sharply, eyes fluttering open before closing again. That made 7 people pulled from the water and breathing, but there were still more floating, and I didn't know how many were already gone. My arms shook as I pulled myself out of the pool, scanning for the next victim. A man in his 30s floated near the rope that divided shallow from deep, his swimming trunks bright red against the blue. I jumped back in and got him to the edge, where 2 bystanders helped drag him out. He started breathing on his own after 10 compressions, so I moved on before confirming he'd stay conscious. The 9th rescue was another kid, this one maybe 10 years old, floating near the ladder in the deep end. His skin had a gray tint that made my stomach drop as I hauled him onto the concrete. No pulse, no breathing. CPR started again, my shoulders screaming in protest as I compressed his chest 30 times before breathing into his mouth. Nothing. Another cycle. Nothing. 3rd cycle. And he coughed, then vomited, then started breathing in ragged gasps that sounded like the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. I counted 11 people pulled from the water when the sirens finally arrived, ambulances and fire trucks flooding the parking lot with flashing lights. Paramedics rushed through the gate carrying equipment and stretchers, their uniforms bright against the crowd of wet, terrified parents and kids scattered across the deck. I was in the water pulling up victim number 12 when someone grabbed my shoulder and told me to stop, that professionals were here now and I needed to get checked out myself. The paramedic who examined me had kind eyes and steady hands, checking my pupils and asking questions I could barely process through the adrenaline crash hitting my system. My whole body shook uncontrollably, teeth chattering, even though the temperature was pushing 90 degrees. He wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and tried to get me to sit down, but I couldn't stop watching the organized chaos of the rescue effort happening around the pool. Teams of paramedics worked on victims spread across the deck, performing CPR and inserting IVs and loading people onto stretchers. The twin girl I'd pulled up fourth was crying for her mother while a paramedic checked her vitals. The teenage boy sat against the fence looking dazed, but breathing. The elderly woman was on a stretcher surrounded by paramedics working frantically, their voices urgent and clipped. I counted at least 20 stretchers being loaded into ambulances, which meant there were more victims than the 12 I'd personally pulled from the water. Other lifeguards must have been working the shallow end while I focused on the deep section, or maybe bystanders had jumped in to help. Everything was blurry and disjointed, like watching a movie with frames missing. Devin Thatcher, the pool manager, appeared beside me looking pale and sick. He'd been in his office doing paperwork when the emergency started, and now he stood there staring at the scene like he couldn't quite believe it was real. He asked if I was okay, and I nodded because I didn't trust my voice to work properly. Then he asked how many people I'd pulled out, and I told him 12, maybe 13. I'd lost count after the elderly woman. His face went even paler, and he muttered something about chemical levels and maintenance schedules that I didn't understand. A police officer approached and asked me to describe what happened, pulling out a notepad and pen. I started explaining about the first kid going under, but the words came out wrong and jumbled because my brain was still processing the immediate crisis and couldn't shift to narrative mode. The officer told me to take my time, that I wasn't in trouble, they just needed to understand what happened. That's when I noticed the pool water looked wrong. Not the normal blue-green of chlorinated water, but slightly cloudy with a yellowish tint that hadn't been there when my shift started 2 hours ago. The officer followed my gaze and wrote something in his notebook, then asked if I'd noticed anything unusual before people started drowning. I told him the water looked normal at 2 o'clock when I climbed onto the stand, crystal clear like it always was after the morning maintenance check. He asked about the maintenance check, and I explained that Devin and his assistant manager performed chemical tests every morning before opening, adjusting chlorine and pH levels to keep the water safe. The officer wrote more notes and asked who the assistant manager was. Devin said his name was Kyle Brenner, and he'd left at 1:30 for a dentist appointment, about 30 minutes before people started going under. The ambulances started pulling away, sirens wailing as they rushed victims to hospitals across the city. I counted 16 ambulances total, which meant at least 16 people had been unconscious in the water. The paramedic who'd checked me earlier came back and said I was being transported to the hospital for observation, that anyone who'd been in the pool water needed to be examined and tested. I started to argue that I was fine, that I'd only been in the water for rescues, but he cut me off and said it wasn't optional, and something in the water had caused mass unconsciousness, and they needed to make sure everyone who'd been exposed was monitored. The word poisoning hung in the air, unspoken, but obvious. Devin was being loaded into a separate ambulance, and I could see other lifeguards and pool staff being directed toward medical vehicles. The entire facility was being evacuated and sealed off, yellow caution tape going up around the perimeter while police officers kept the growing crowd of concerned family members behind the barriers. The emergency room was chaos when we arrived, every bed filled with pool victims in various states of consciousness. Doctors and nurses moved between patients with organized urgency, calling out orders and updating charts. A nurse led me to a bed in the overflow area and started an IV while asking questions about my symptoms. I told her I felt fine except for exhausted muscles and shaking from adrenaline, but she said they were testing everyone's blood for toxins and keeping people overnight for observation. The chemical tests would take several hours to process, and until they knew what had contaminated the water, everyone who'd been exposed was considered at risk. She drew 4 vials of blood from my arm and labeled them with codes I didn't understand. Through the curtain separating beds, I could hear the twin girl crying for her sister, and a nurse assuring her that her sister was fine, just in a different part of the hospital getting treated. The elderly woman was in the ICU, the nurse mentioned quietly to someone, her condition critical but stable. 3 hours later, a doctor appeared at my bedside with a tablet and a grim expression. He introduced himself as Dr. Adrian Walsh and said my blood tests showed elevated levels of chlorine gas exposure, which was consistent with what they were seeing in the other victims. The pool's chemical system had malfunctioned and released a massive dose of chlorine gas into the water, causing rapid unconsciousness in anyone swimming when it happened. Chlorine gas was heavier than air, so it had accumulated at the water's surface before dissolving, which explained why people went under so quickly without warning. He said I was lucky I'd been out of the water when it happened, that the victims who'd been swimming had inhaled concentrated chlorine gas directly from the surface. My exposure came from the rescue dives, which meant I'd gotten smaller doses while holding my breath. The doctor explained that chlorine gas poisoning could cause respiratory damage, chemical burns to the lungs, and cardiac complications if the exposure was severe enough. Most of the victims were stable now, but 3 were in critical condition, including the elderly woman I'd pulled from the deep end. The news coverage started that night, local stations running breaking news segments about the mass casualty event at Riverside Community Pool. My name appeared in the reports as the lifeguard who'd pulled 12 victims from the water before paramedics arrived. The headlines called me a hero, showing aerial footage of the pool surrounded by emergency vehicles and interviewing parents whose children I'd saved. The mother of the first boy I'd rescued cried on camera talking about how I'd brought her son back to life. The twins' father described watching me perform CPR on both his daughters simultaneously. The teenage boy's family set up a GoFundMe to pay for my college tuition as a thank you gift. The attention felt wrong and uncomfortable, like I was being praised for something that was just basic job requirements. Any lifeguard would have done the same thing. The certification training specifically covered mass casualty scenarios and triage protocols. I'd just followed my training. The next morning, Devin called my cell phone at 7 asking me to come to an emergency meeting at the pool's administrative office. His voice sounded strained and formal, completely different from his usual casual manager tone. I arrived at 9 to find him sitting across from two people in business suits who introduced themselves as representatives from the pool's liability insurance company. They had a folder full of documents spread across the conference table, and one of them asked me to describe the incident again in detail. I walked through the timeline starting from the first whistle blast, explaining each rescue and the state of each victim when I pulled them out. They took notes and asked specific questions about the water's appearance, the timing of events, and whether I'd noticed anyone tampering with the chemical equipment. I said I hadn't been near the pump room all day, that my job was watching the swimmers, not checking equipment. That's when the insurance representative dropped the file on the table and told me I was being terminated effective immediately for gross negligence and abandonment of duty. The words didn't make sense at first, like she'd said them in a foreign language my brain couldn't translate. I asked her to repeat it, and she did, slower this time, explaining that by leaving my lifeguard stand to perform rescues, I'd abandoned my post and left the remaining swimmers unsupervised. Pool regulations required the lifeguard on duty to remain at their station at all times, calling for backup rather than leaving the stand. My actions, while well-intentioned, had violated protocol and created liability for the facility. If I'd stayed at my post and used the emergency phone to summon help, the professional rescue teams could have arrived faster and potentially saved the 3 people who were still in critical condition. Instead, I'd chosen to play hero and made the situation worse by contaminating myself with the poisoned water, requiring additional resources to treat me instead of focusing those resources on actual victims. My mouth opened, but no words came out because the logic was so twisted and backwards that I couldn't form a coherent response. Devin sat there staring at his hands, not meeting my eyes. The insurance woman continued talking about how the facility's liability coverage didn't extend to employees who violated safety protocols, and that by firing me for cause, they were protecting themselves from potential lawsuits. She had termination papers already prepared, everything typed up and official with spaces for signatures. The second insurance representative added that if I signed the documents without protest, they'd agree not to pursue legal action against me personally for the protocol violations. If I refused to sign or tried to fight the termination, they'd have no choice but to file charges for reckless endangerment and failure to follow emergency procedures. The implication was clear: take the firing quietly or face criminal charges and civil lawsuits. I signed the papers because I was 19 years old and terrified and didn't understand how the legal system worked well enough to know if they were bluffing. My hands shook as I wrote my name across the bottom of 3 different forms, each one stating that I acknowledged the protocol violations and accepted termination for cause. The insurance woman collected the documents and stood up, shaking Devin's hand before leaving the office without another word to me. Devin finally looked at me after they left and said he was sorry, that he'd fought against this decision, but the insurance company had final say on personnel matters. He admitted that he'd been the one who'd done the morning chemical check, not Kyle Brenner, who wasn't even scheduled to work that day. The dentist appointment story was a lie he'd told police to buy time while figuring out what had gone wrong. He'd miscalculated the chlorine dosage and accidentally dumped a week's worth of chemicals into the system at once, creating the gas buildup that poisoned everyone. The confession hit me like cold water to the face. Devin had caused the mass poisoning through his own negligence, then blamed me for violating protocol when I tried to save the victims of his mistake. He was covering his own liability by making me the scapegoat, using insurance company pressure to force my silence. I asked him if he was planning to tell the police the truth, and he said no, that admitting fault would destroy him financially and legally. The investigation was focusing on equipment malfunction, and he planned to let that narrative stand. If I stayed quiet and accepted the firing, he'd make sure I received 3 months severance pay and a neutral employment reference. If I told anyone what he'd just admitted, he'd testify that I'd been negligent in my duties and make sure I faced criminal charges for the deaths if any of the critical patients didn't survive. His voice was calm and reasonable while he outlined this blackmail, like he was discussing weekend scheduling instead of threatening my entire future. I walked out of that office in a daze, my brain refusing to process what had just happened. The parking lot was empty except for my car, the pool still surrounded by caution tape and closed for investigation. News vans were parked along the street, reporters doing live updates about the tragedy and the heroic lifeguard who'd saved so many lives. They didn't know I'd just been fired for saving those lives. They didn't know the manager who caused the poisoning was blaming equipment failure to save himself. I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to decide what to do, my phone buzzing with text messages from friends and family who'd seen the news coverage. My mom wanted to know if I was okay. My best friend Sienna asked if the hospital had released me yet. The twins' father had sent a message thanking me again for saving his daughters and asking for my address so he could send a proper thank you gift. The news story shifted 3 days later when one of the critical patients died. The elderly woman, whose name was Margaret Holloway, passed away from complications related to chlorine gas exposure and prolonged oxygen deprivation. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide caused by chemical poisoning, which meant the investigation escalated from negligence to potential criminal charges. Police interviewed everyone who'd been at the pool, including me, asking detailed questions about the timeline and what I'd observed. I told them about the water looking normal when I started my shift, about the first kid going under, about pulling 12 people from the water before paramedics arrived. They asked about Devin and the morning maintenance check, and I repeated what he'd told me about Kyle Brenner leaving early. The detective taking my statement wrote everything down and asked if I'd noticed anything unusual about Devin's behavior after the incident. I said he'd seemed shocked and pale, which was true, and left out the part about him confessing to causing the poisoning. The guilt of lying to police ate at me for 2 days before I broke and called Sienna to tell her everything. We sat in her car parked at the beach while I explained about the meeting with the insurance representatives, Devin's confession, the threats about criminal charges if I spoke up. She listened without interrupting and then asked why I was protecting a man who'd killed someone through negligence and then blamed me for trying to save his victims. I said I was scared of the legal consequences, that I didn't have money for a lawyer, that my word against Devin's wouldn't be enough without proof. She pulled out her phone and asked if I'd be willing to get proof, because her older brother worked in tech and could help. I asked what she meant, and she explained that if Devin had confessed once, he might confess again if he thought he was in private. A recording of that confession would be enough to take to the police and clear my name while exposing the truth. The plan felt risky and slightly insane, but the alternative was living with the knowledge that I'd helped cover up a homicide. I called Devin the next morning asking to meet privately, telling him I was struggling with what to do and needed his advice. He agreed immediately, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop across town where no one would recognize us. I wore the small recording device Sienna's brother had given me, clipped inside my jacket pocket with the microphone hidden in a button. The device looked like a regular phone battery pack, nothing that would raise suspicion if Devin noticed it. We sat in the back corner of the coffee shop, and I told him the police had questioned me again, that they were asking specific questions about the maintenance schedule and Kyle Brenner. Devin's face went tight, and he asked what I'd told them. I said I'd stuck to the story about Kyle leaving early, but that the detective seemed suspicious and kept pushing for more details. Devin leaned across the table and lowered his voice, explaining that we both needed to stay consistent with the equipment malfunction narrative. He said the police couldn't prove it was human error unless someone admitted to it, and as long as we stuck together, the investigation would conclude with mechanical failure and no criminal charges. I asked what would happen if Kyle found out he was being blamed for something he didn't do. Devin said Kyle had moved to another state for a new job and wasn't following the news coverage, that by the time anyone thought to contact him, the investigation would be closed. He was gambling that Kyle wouldn't randomly check back on a pool he'd left weeks ago. I pushed a little harder, saying that Margaret Holloway's death made this a homicide investigation, and they'd be more thorough. Devin's mask slipped and he admitted he'd panicked during the morning chemical check, that the measuring equipment was confusing and he'd added chlorine without properly checking the existing levels. The confession poured out once he started talking, like he'd been holding it inside and needed to tell someone. He explained that budget cuts had eliminated the assistant manager position, so he'd been doing all the maintenance himself despite not being fully trained on the chemical systems. The previous manager had left detailed instructions, but Devin had misread the measurements and accidentally created a chlorine concentration 30 times higher than safe levels. The gas had built up slowly over the first hour after opening, not causing immediate problems, but gradually releasing into the air at water surface level. By the time I started my shift at 2, the concentration was high enough to cause rapid unconsciousness in anyone swimming. He'd realized his mistake when he came back from his office and saw people floating, but by then, it was too late to fix it. His choice to blame me and the insurance company's decision to fire me was about protecting the pool's owners from a massive lawsuit that would bankrupt them. If the truth came out, they'd lose everything, and Devin would face criminal charges for negligent homicide. I left that meeting with 40 minutes of recorded confession on the device in my pocket. Sienna's brother helped me make backup copies on 3 different drives before we took the recording to a lawyer her family knew. The lawyer listened to the entire tape without speaking, his expression getting grimmer with each passing minute. When it finished, he explained that the recording was legally admissible in our state because only one party needed to consent to recording, and I'd consented by being present. The confession established clear evidence of negligent homicide, evidence tampering through the false statements about Kyle Brenner, and attempted obstruction of justice by coercing my silence. He said I should take this to the police immediately and offer to cooperate fully with their investigation. The recording would likely result in criminal charges against Devon and a reopening of the investigation into the pool's maintenance practices and ownership liability. The detective who'd interviewed me before looked shocked when I showed up at the police station with the lawyer and the recording. We sat in an interrogation room while he listened to Devon's confession play through speakers that made every word sound harsh and mechanical. The detective stopped the recording twice to confirm details, asking if I'd coerced or entrapped Devon into confessing. My lawyer explained that I'd simply asked to meet, and Devon had volunteered everything without prompting or pressure. The recording showed Devon initiating the confession and providing specific details about his actions without any leading questions from me. When the playback finished, the detective said they'd need to verify the recording's authenticity through forensic analysis, but assuming it was legitimate, they'd be moving forward with criminal charges against Devon and reopening the entire investigation. He asked why I'd lied in my initial statement about Kyle Brenner, and I explained about the threats from the insurance company and my fear of criminal liability. The arrest happened 3 days later. News cameras capturing Devon being led out of the pool's administrative office in handcuffs. The charges included negligent homicide in Margaret Holloway's death, 23 counts of reckless endangerment for the surviving victims, obstruction of justice for lying to police, and evidence tampering for the false statements about Kyle Brenner. The story exploded across local and national news, headlines shifting from "Hero Lifeguard Saves Dozens" to "Pool Manager Arrested After Deadly Chemical Disaster." My name appeared in new articles explaining how I'd been fired for violating protocol after saving lives, then secretly recorded the confession that led to the real culprit's arrest. The narrative sparked outrage about liability insurance companies prioritizing corporate protection over employee rights and public safety. Parents whose children I'd rescued started organizing protests outside the pool, demanding accountability from the ownership group that had cut staffing and training budgets. The insurance company representatives who'd fired me were suddenly unavailable for comment, hiding behind corporate lawyers who issued statements about conducting internal reviews of the termination decision. The pool's ownership group released a public apology and announced they were offering to reinstate me with back pay and a promotion to head lifeguard, which felt like a transparent attempt to avoid a lawsuit. My lawyer advised me to decline the offer because accepting it might limit my ability to pursue legal action later. Instead, he suggested we file a wrongful termination suit against both the pool management company and the insurance company for firing me in retaliation for performing my job duties. The case had strong merit given the documented timeline of events and the obvious connection between my rescue efforts and the retaliatory termination. Multiple law firms reached out offering to represent me pro bono because the case had attracted so much media attention. The trial preparation took 9 months, during which Devon pleaded not guilty and tried to argue that the chemical malfunction was a genuine accident that anyone could have made. His defense attorney painted him as a hardworking manager overwhelmed by budget cuts and inadequate training, suggesting the pool's owners bore primary responsibility for creating unsafe conditions. The prosecution used my recording to establish that Devon had knowingly lied to investigators and actively worked to cover up his negligence, which undermined any claim of innocent mistake. They brought in expert witnesses who testified that proper training and basic attention to safety protocols would have prevented the chemical disaster, and that Devon's decision to perform maintenance alone without proper certification violated multiple safety regulations. The jury heard testimony from parents of victims, doctors who'd treated the poisoning cases, and engineers who explained exactly how Devon's mistakes had created lethal gas concentrations in the water. Margaret Holloway's daughter testified about watching her mother die slowly from respiratory failure caused by the chlorine gas exposure. She described visiting the hospital every day for 2 weeks while machines kept her mother alive, watching her struggle to breathe through damaged lungs. The elderly woman had been a retired teacher who swam laps every morning to stay healthy, she explained. Someone who dedicated her life to helping others and died because one person couldn't be bothered to follow basic safety procedures. Her testimony left several jurors crying, and Devon stared at his hands throughout the entire statement. The twins' father testified about the nightmares his daughter still had months later, how they were terrified of water now and needed therapy to cope with the trauma. The first boy I'd rescued was wheeled into court in a wheelchair, still recovering from brain damage caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation. His mother explained that doctors weren't sure if he'd ever fully recover, that her energetic 7-year-old might never walk or talk normally again because of someone else's negligence. The verdict came back guilty on all charges after 3 days of deliberation. Devon was sentenced to 12 years in prison for negligent homicide and reckless endangerment, with eligibility for parole after 8 years. The judge's statement focused on the breach of public trust, noting that people who manage public facilities have heightened responsibility for safety, and that Devon's actions showed complete disregard for the lives in his care. His attempt to blame me and force my silence through threats demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an unwillingness to accept responsibility even after causing a death. The families of victims were present for the sentencing, some crying with relief while others looked hollow and unsatisfied because no prison term would bring back Margaret Holloway or heal the permanent damage done to their children. My wrongful termination lawsuit settled out of court 6 weeks after Devon's conviction. The insurance company agreed to pay $300,000 in damages and issue a public apology acknowledging that firing me had been incorrect and contrary to the actual circumstances of the incident. The pool management company paid an additional $100,000 and agreed to implement new safety protocols, including mandatory dual-person chemical handling and weekly third-party inspections. The settlement included a clause requiring them to revise their emergency protocols to explicitly allow lifeguards to leave their posts during active drowning situations, correcting the absurd policy that had been used to justify my termination. Several other lifeguards who'd been at the pool that day received smaller settlements after coming forward with their own stories of being pressured to stay silent about safety concerns. The twins graduated from intensive therapy and sent me a video of them swimming again, nervous but determined to reclaim something the incident had stolen. The first boy I'd rescued remained in rehabilitation, making slow progress with speech and motor skills. His mother told reporters she was grateful he survived even with the challenges he faced. The teenage boy went on to become a certified lifeguard himself, saying the incident had shown him the importance of people willing to act when seconds matter. Margaret Holloway's daughter established a foundation in her mother's name funding water safety education and advocacy for stronger pool safety regulations. She asked me to serve on the advisory board, and I said yes, because it felt like the only meaningful response to everything that had happened. I finished my degree in emergency medical services and took a job with the fire department doing water rescue operations. The incident taught me that doing the right thing often comes with consequences you can't predict or control, that institutions will protect themselves over individuals every time, and that sometimes you have to risk everything to live with yourself. The scars from that day show up in unexpected ways. Flashbacks triggered by chlorine smell or the sound of children playing in water, but they also remind me that survival matters more than protocol, and courage means acting even when the system punishes you for it. 12 people are alive because I left my post that afternoon, and no wrongful termination or threatened criminal charge can change that fundamental truth. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.